Well, welcome everyone. Let's get started. My name is Lukas. I'm a research associate at the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at FIU, and I'd like to welcome you today on behalf of the center and the center's director, Dr. Markus Thiel. This roundtable is sponsored by the German Federal Foreign Ministry, an initiative called Wunderbar Together, and it's celebrating the German-American friendship. This year is their Deutschlandjahr, Year of Germany, which is taking place in the US. Years prior, it's been taking place in Japan, Brazil, other countries, and this year from October 2018 to late 2019, it's the US. And this initiative is being administered by the Goethe Institute and is also supported by the Federation of German Industries, BDI. Events are being held all across the US in conjunction with 200 different organizations. Professor Louise Davidson-Schmich from and Markus Thiel from FIU secured funding as part of this, and the funding will be used to host a series of 5 roundtables. One already took place at it's the second one at FIU, and some networking sessions like this one, all focusing on Germany, the US, and challenges in the 21st century. Each gets experts together to talk about the two countries' common experiences and how they can learn from one another. So tonight we have 3 distinguished speakers from and FIU. Dr. Louise Davidson-Schmich is Professor of Political Science at the University of Miami and a faculty member in their Women's and Gender Studies program. She received her PhD from Duke University. She's an expert on German politics and gender and politics. Her most recent books include Gender Quotas and Democratic Participation, Recruiting Candidates for Elective Offices in Germany, which looks at the efforts to achieve gender balance among elected officials in Germany, and Gender Institutions and Intersections, an edited collection that looks at minority women's experiences with public policy in Germany. Tonight, she'll speak first about the women's representation politics in Germany and in the US, and later, on behalf of Dr. Markus Thiel, who could not be here tonight, about LGBTI rights in both countries. Our second speaker, Dr. Susanne Zwingel, is an Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at FIU. She received her PhD in Political Science from Ruhr University, Bochum, Germany, and is an expert in international women's rights and gender equality advocacy around the world. Her recent books include Translating International Women's Rights, the CEDAW Convention in Context, and the edited collection Feminist Strategies in International Governance. Tonight, she will compare the US and Germany in terms of their standing vis-à-vis international standards of gender equality, and she'll talk about the two countries' reactions to the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or short for CEDAW, both at the governmental and non-governmental levels. And our third speaker, Dr. Merike Blofield, is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Miami and serves as the Director of UM's Women and Gender Studies program. She's an expert on gender and politics, specifically family policy. She was the lead coordinating author of a chapter on the pluralization of families for the International Panel on Social Progress, and she worked with the United Nations to improve family policies worldwide. Her most recent book is Care, Work and Class, Domestic Workers' Struggle for Equal Rights in Latin America. Tonight she will speak about reproductive rights and work-family balance policies in Germany and the US, giving a worldwide comparative perspective. Each of our speakers will speak for about 10 minutes. I'll remind them when the time has come for each of them to be respectful. And then we will open the floor to questions and answers once we've heard the 4 presentations. So without further ado, Dr. Louise Davidson-Schmich will start us off.
Thank you very much. Before I get going, don't take this out of my 10 minutes. I do want to say thank you very, very much to the folks here at FIU. It's been almost a year since Marcus Thiel and I started planning this series of events, and it's very exciting that we're actually having our first event here at FIU. I'm very sorry that Marcus can't be here to join us, but I'm very, very thankful that people like Susanne and Lukas and Christine Callie, who's not here this evening, were able to step in when Marcus couldn't help us out to put this evening together. So I'm very, very grateful, because I know you all have busy schedules, and one of you is not even compensated. And so it was very, very good of you to help out with this event. So I'm very thankful for that. What I'd like to do tonight is to talk about gender and political representation in both Germany and in the United States. And my point of departure is that both Germany and the United States have something in common. They have political systems in common, and that is that they're representative democracies. And you might remember from your civics class that you took in middle school or high school that the word democracy has two parts. Krasi has to do with power, and demos has to do with the people. So democracy is a system where the people wield political power. And in modern large states like Germany and the United States, people don't do so directly by going to Washington or going to Berlin to make the laws. They're not actually present in decision making, but they elect representatives to represent themselves in the national capital to make decisions. And in theory, these representatives should be representative of the population as a whole. Oops, that's the wrong direction. In practice, however, the representatives don't necessarily always represent the population as a whole. And that's true everywhere, not just in Germany and the United States. I don't mean to pick on them here, but I want to focus on them. There's many ways in which our representatives don't represent the underlying population. In terms of race or ethnicity, it's much more likely in the United States that elected officials are white, minorities are underrepresented. In Germany, it's much more likely that ethnic or native Germans are represented, and people of immigrant background are underrepresented. In both countries, Christians are overrepresented in comparison to their population, and Muslims and other religious minorities are underrepresented. In both countries, elected officials are a lot more affluent and have more resources than do the general population. That gulf is a lot bigger in the United States, but it's also present in Germany as well. But what I want to focus on this evening is the gender of elected officials. In both countries, approximately half of the population is male and half the population is female. But in both countries, we can see that political power is not divided up in the same way. And that's been true consistently across both countries' histories. So what I'd like to do is to take a historical look and see what women's underrepresentation has looked like politically. And I want to draw some parallels between the countries. In both countries, women are underrepresented, but also draw some distinctions between the two countries, because we can see some differences between Germany and the United States in this regard. So the United States became a democracy back in the 1700s. I'm going to fast forward to 1948, when the Federal Republic of Germany was established, and take a look at the United States Congress, the House and the Senate, and the German legislature, the Bundestag. In 1948, 1.5% of Congress people were female. So basically, Congress was more than 98% male. And the women who were present in Congress were primarily widows whose husband had been elected, had died, and they were kind of serving out his term until another election could be held. Germany's figure was higher, 6.8%, but that's clearly not anywhere near close to 50%. So let's fast forward again a generation and take a look at 1968. In 1968, things had barely changed. A generation into the Federal Republic. Starting in the 1960s, this became an issue of concern to feminists in both countries, and feminists in both countries sought solutions to women's political underrepresentation. And one of the observations that people made was that there was what we can call a pipeline problem. So elected officials are usually drawn from the ranks of certain professions. For example, in the United States, like law, and in Germany, they're also drawn from the ranks of political parties. And at that time, in both Germany and the United States, the legal profession, for example, was overwhelmingly male. Women didn't even necessarily weren't able to even access law school, and German political parties were almost overwhelmingly male. So feminists began to address these problems starting in the 1960s into the 1970s. If we jump forward another decade, we can see that in 1978, the numbers again had barely budged or changed. Starting in the 1980s, however, and both of these numbers are very low and very flat across countries. Starting in the 1980s, we can start to see some change in the two countries, and they start to diverge. So the blue line here is Germany, and the orange line is the United States. And we can see by 1988, another decade having gone by, women broke the 15% barrier in Germany, whereas women's representation in the United States was flat, and in fact it was lower than it was in Germany in 1948. If we scroll forward to the year 2008, we can see that the United States is still kind of stuck around the 15% range, whereas Germany is over into the 30% range. And in fact, if we go up to 2017, before the last election in Germany and the United States, we can see women's representation is almost double in Germany, almost 40%, whereas in the United States, it didn't break the 20% barrier until last week or the week before. So the United States and Germany start to diverge over time. And if we were to look at the rest of the world, we would see that Germany is much more like other countries in Northern Europe, much more like other countries in Latin America. And the United States looks more like areas of Africa or the Middle East or the Pacific. So what happened in Germany and what happened in other parts of the world that didn't seem to happen in the United States? And these two issues, what happened in Germany and what happened in the rest of the world, are actually quite closely related, because Germany and some other Northern European countries made some pioneering changes to their political systems in the 1980s that help account for some of this variance between the two countries. In the 1980s, we see for the first time in Germany the election of the Green Party. The Green Party was a party that was founded in part by feminists who had been active in the Social Democratic Party, or to some degree in the Christian Democratic Party. They had joined political parties hoping to solve that pipeline problem and get elected and make political careers. And what happened was their representation in the Social Democratic Party in Germany went up, and the percentage of women elected among the Social Democrats went down. So women were very frustrated about not making inroads within the party. At the same time, a lot of young people were also frustrated at the mainstream party's failure to respond to environmental issues or to peace issues or other types of social justice issues that they were concerned about. So the Greens set about making a new political party that would be structured in a new way and would select candidates in a new way. So one of the things that was new about the Greens was that they decided for all positions of leadership, from the ground level here, like with colleges and universities, all the way up to the national level, they would have male and female co-chairs. So male and female both in positions of leadership, not just one sex or the other. The other thing that they would do was they would select their candidates for elective office in a new way. And so to understand this, you need to know a little bit about the German electoral system. Half of the candidates in the Bundestag, the German national parliament, are elected just like the United States. Each party picks one candidate, each voter picks one person, and the candidate with the most votes wins, even if it's just one vote, like here in Florida. And all the rest of the candidates lose. The second part of the German ballot and the second half of the Bundestag is much more proportional in nature. It uses proportional representation, in which parties put together a list of candidates in ranked order, and voters vote not for the people, but for the party. And then the number of the seats that are available, let's use a hypothetical example of 10 seats here, are divided up in proportion to the percentage of the votes that parties get. So for example, if this party wins 40%, this party wins 40%, and this party wins 20%, and there were 10 seats, they get 4 of the top 4 candidates on their list. They get 4 of the top 4 candidates on their list, and the Greens, or this party, would get 2, the top 2 candidates on their list. The Greens said, when we make our list of candidates, we're going to make a list of female candidates, we're going to make a list of male candidates, and we're going to zip them together like the teeth of a zipper and alternate. So our odd-numbered candidates are all women, our even-numbered candidates are all men. So in this case, if the Greens won 2 seats, they'd elect a man and a woman. This was very effective in getting women into parliament. It was very effective in attracting female voters. So women started to move from the Social Democrats to the Greens, at which point the Social Democrats said, oh, maybe we should do this too. So now they have zipper lists for Bundestag elections. The Left Party also does this in Germany, and even the Christian Democrats have lists that are gender balanced. It's not 50-50, but 30-60. And we can see the effectiveness. If we look at the results of the most recent Bundestag election, we can see that the people who are elected from parties that used zipper quotas or quotas for their lists, we have gender parity. And when parties don't use lists or they're using the electoral system like we have in the United States, the results look a lot more like the United States Congress. So many, many more men, the gray bars, represented than the women in black. And so, whoops, hold on one second. So we can see in international perspective, Germany currently ranks 46 out of 190 countries worldwide in terms of women's representation. And the United States is ranked 77th out of 186 countries after Afghanistan and Iraq. And the reason why Afghanistan and Iraq do well is that their legislatures use quota rules like Germany does, because when the United States invaded those countries after a war, they said, you have to employ these rules because gender balance in politics is important. Obviously not something that we practice at home. I'll skip over my last few slides, but our executive branches are similarly ungender balanced in our 2 countries. If we look at the most recent events, women's participation in Germany went down, the blue line, and up in the United States. And that in part has to do with the election results. So in Germany, you see the rise of the Alternative for Germany, which is a party that doesn't use quotas and didn't have very many female candidates. And we can see in the United States, we just had this blue wave where more Democrats won seats. Democrats, even though they don't use quotas, they have a similar ideology that gender balance is important, and so they brought a lot of new women into the House. Whereas if we look at the Republican Party, we can see it looks a lot like the 1980s. And I'll stop here, and I just want to call your attention to one point, and that is that women and men who are elected tend to have different policy priorities and also somewhat different policy positions. And we can see the impact of this, I think, with our next 2 speakers who are going to be talking about some policy differences between the 2 countries. So I'll stop here and turn it over to Susanne.
I think I'll just stand here. Well, thank you first and foremost for organizing this. I'm very, very honored to be part of this series. I'm actually not really a scholar of Germany, but I am German, so I have some, from my international perspective, which sort of takes different countries as cases, I think I have some connection to it. And of course, we are in the United States here, even if it oftentimes feels a little more Caribbean, at least to me. So it's nice to compare those 2. And it's also nice that you, in an evening in Miami, that you're interested in those 2 countries in particular. So that's great. Thanks for being here. So I wanted to take a little bit more of a sort of an outward perspective and look at the 2 countries using 2 different international standards. Okay, and the first standard is going to be a measurement view. Okay, as you know, at least the international relations people here, we are by now pretty obsessed to try to think about different states in the world sort of in ranking terms, and we have all those indicators that hopefully tell us something about those countries. Of course, what they tell us is relatively superficial, but the good part of it is that it's you can make a comparison, a cross-national comparison. So that's my first instrument I wanted to look at first. The Human Development Index, you're probably all familiar with it, measures the development of a country using 3 different measurements. One is, life expectancy, which is supposed to represent overall health of the population, years of schooling, and income. Okay, that's the 3 components. The images that you see here, I don't know if does this also have a little light? Not sure. Oh. Anyway, so the images that you see here, they come out of the United Nations Development Report. Okay, it's maybe a little hard to see. So it's starting here from 0 up in this direction. You have just the general Human Development Index. Okay, this side you can forget for a moment because I'm not going to talk about it. It's the inequality adjusted Human Development Index. Here we have a gender-related development index that basically thinks about human development, asking the question, is this gender equal development or not? And down here we have the so-called gender inequality index, and that asks how much development is lost due to gender inequality. Okay? You have the 2 countries, Germany and United States, compared. The darker part is actually, that's the same on both sides. As you can see, this is the world average, okay, and the lighter part is each particular country. And you can see a few things. Number one, of course, that the general HDI is higher for both countries because they're highly developed countries. It's also the GDI is also a little better than world average. And the loss due to gender inequality is smaller in Germany and in the US than in world comparison. And you can also see that it's actually smaller in Germany than in the US. Okay? So altogether, you can see that those 2 rank relatively high. Germany a little better than the US, but it's actually, if you think also about over time, it's not all that much different. I think something that Louise said before, I also want to echo, there's of course a lot of similarities between those countries. So if we look at the gender-related Human Development Index, we actually see, so first we saw that Germany is a little ahead in terms of human development. In terms of, is this gender equal? Actually, the US is a tiny little bit better. Okay, you see a 0.992 versus a 0.967. So 1 is the extreme, that's the best possibility, so that's pretty good actually, right? Why is this? If you look at those 3 measures for each, so life expectancy is actually, again, it's a little better in Germany overall. The ratio, the first one here is always, this is female, this is male. This is a general worldwide trend that women grow older than men, so they die later, so they're a little healthier, generally speaking. There's not much gender difference. Here in the mean years of schooling, there's a little bit of a difference because we have an even number of years in the US. In Germany, men on average go a little bit longer to school, so I guess this is what the difference makes. You can also see that all in all, US employees or people who earn money earn a little more than in Germany, and actually you see that the wage gap with this data, which is from 2017, actually Germany is a little better, but not much. So you see a very similar distribution here also, which is, by the way, also a worldwide trend, right? That women all over the world earn less than men. So, okay. Okay, now let's, so that's what we have. It's so far not much difference, I would say, okay? When we look at the gender inequality index, here we see a few differences, okay? One thing Louise has already talked about is here this line about female and male shares of parliamentary seats, okay? About 20% in the US for women, 80% for men, much higher in Germany, but if you just sort of also pay attention to the fact that actually it's still by far not half. It has actually also stalled at that level. Also, if you look at female labor market participation, this is a relatively similar measure here that we have. The secondary the female and male secondary education level is also relatively similar, tiny bit differences. I think what's the most important thing in terms of significant differences is the first two measures, okay? So that's the maternal mortality ratio and the adolescent birth rate. Those are measures of reproductive health in a way, okay? So maternal mortality tells you something about how well women around childbirth are taken care of by a country. And the adolescent birth rate tells you something about how much information is there about contraception and how much access to contraception and also abortion, generally speaking. And there you see quite a significant difference. Okay, so this is actually a problem for the US, right? The number for the maternal mortality is pretty high. It's actually in the same level as Saudi Arabia, just as a comparison. But also, on the other hand, you would say that Saudi Arabia has a very good provision of health care for women, so because it's a very wealthy country. But that is, for a developed country, a problematic number. It's actually still, in worldwide comparison, not all that high. I mean, there are countries that have a number of 500 there, which tells you that giving birth is really the most dangerous thing you can do in the country, so to say. But that is problematic. And the same you can see also with the adolescent birth rate. So I think that explains a little bit why the US loses so much more in terms of its development due to gender inequality, okay? So far, what we've seen is very general. And again, I mean, I pointed to those differences, but if we think worldwide, they're both, so to say, still doing pretty well, okay? Now I would like to switch to another sort of way of looking at the countries from an international perspective. For several reasons, because this, of course, as I said, is very superficial. In a way, you have, with the data that you have, you spotlight something and don't see other things. Like, for example, when you look here at the labor market participation, we see how many people participate, but not if they participate part-time or full-time, what kind of work they are doing, and so forth, right? So there's a lot of stuff that we don't see in those numbers, of course. So what I actually focus my work mostly on is a much more in-depth instrument. It's the Women's Rights Convention. Lukas kindly mentioned this before. This is a treaty, a human rights treaty that focuses on the rights of women that exists since 1979, that states can basically decide to ratify. If they decide to ratify it, they commit to work towards the realization of women's rights. And the convention spells this out in three broad terms. I'm not going to go into detail, but the three broad terms are elimination of all forms of discrimination. And that is defined as very, very broadly discrimination in all fields of life, including also private life, for example. And the second component is to reach gender equality. And here the assumption is really that in many fields of life, men have an advantage and women have to sort of move up there, so to say. And that's spelled out in the convention in education, in political life, in employment, in the family also. And the third component is that the state is actually responsible to work for that, right? So if a state ratifies this convention, it says, yes, we're going to work for that, okay? And we also provide what we do and how we have progressed to an expert committee that monitors our progress, right? So they then go to talk to, have a constructive dialogue with this monitoring committee to see if they have actually progressed or not. The committee is very critical and says, like, you have done well here, but here you have a lot of deficits and so forth. And this also has a component of civil society input. So, governments tend to present themselves in a very positive light. So if NGOs also come, they say, like, well, this is actually not what's happening. There's a lot of problems in the country in this area. Now, it would be nice if I could compare how this instrument looks at the US and at Germany, but the US unfortunately did not ratify the instrument, right? Which is a tradition. The US doesn't ratify many international treaties. But the nice thing is that the US also has a very bottom-up political culture, and a lot of localities, including Miami-Dade, actually have adopted an ordinance that says we want to follow this idea. We want to move towards gender equality according to the CEDAW guidelines. So since we are all in Miami-Dade County, I really urge you to ask your political representatives what they do with this, because they actually have said they want to move towards gender equality. So Germany has ratified this convention and has, in fact, undergone a series of dialogues with this expert committee. And I just sort of wanted to pick out a few themes so that you see how this works and what this sort of this dialogue brings about in terms of more deep issues, problems, structures that you need to know about a country as complex as Germany. And of course, if the US had ratified, it would be also a very complex case. And there are many more themes, but I just, I have only 10 minutes. I'm already over, so I keep it to 4. Okay, so first thing, the focus of this committee is very much on discrimination that different types of women experience, right? So remember, again, the numbers that we saw is men and women, this is what they do. But actually, differently located women experience their lives differently, and they have intersectional overlapping forms of discrimination that they experience. So the differences within Germany, prominently between West and East German women, also between migrant women and sort of German women that were born in Germany that have citizenship, women with disabilities. Later on, we also will hear about sexual orientation, transgender women, intersex women, and so forth. They, of course, are in a very different position than a white, straight West German woman like I would be, for example, right? Different kind of what the state needs to do, what society needs to do to say we actually really want to move towards ending this kind of discrimination, right? So the committee looks at that. So you constantly get those questions about, so what does the state do so that these women, this particular set of women, doesn't experience this discrimination? So that's, I think, very important. The diversity, okay? The second very important part is it constantly tells Germany, the committee, I think this is very interesting, how stereotypical this society is organized, right? I love this in a way because, I'm from there, I left, I'm a refugee in a way, right? In a very privileged sense. But it's very true that the stereotypes as they work are, on the one hand, that you have this very sort of distinct understanding of what male and female responsibilities are. So the women are really so much more responsible still for domestic duties, for housework, for taking care of the children. You still have very strong this idea, certainly in the West, and of course the West is the dominant part, that the man is the breadwinner and the woman is the part-time worker and so forth. So you have this pretty strong. You also have, especially in advertisement, you have a lot of sexual objectification of women, which sometimes is sort of couched in sort of a certain sexual libertarianism or something. But in the end, what you have is a lot of bare breasts, really, right? So it's not very liberating, I think, right? And of course, you also have a lot of stereotypes on different levels that intersect with gender, with xenophobic and racist stereotypes. And what this results in terms of a material structure is a very solid gender difference in terms of who does the housework, who earns more. Wage gap is very pronounced, right? Who is a full-time worker? Who's a part-time worker? Who works in which kind of job segment, right? I said this already, who is responsible for childcare? This comes together with the fact that up until now, there's still a lot of a lack of childcare facilities, especially in the western part of the country. So you have this sort of, these stereotypes are sort of materialized in all dimensions of life. This is not the same in all parts of Germany, so West and East are very different here. And also we have a very high significant level of violence that I think the state doesn't really provide a lot of answers for. This is, I say this, but this is also the assessment of the committee, okay? I'll skip this in between, but what I do want to mention at the end is one, I think, very positive dimension of this work of the CEDAW committee. In the dialogue of 2009, there were a lot of non-governmental organizations that came to the committee that were representing intersex and transgender women. And because they were there, and because they talked about how invisible they are in Germany, the committee said to the government, well, you have to actually work with these people. First, you have to recognize they are there, and you have to work something out with them and learn about what kind of discrimination this entails, do something, and so forth. And that has really triggered, I think, a very important, very interesting national debate, which I think you will talk about later a little bit more, right? Okay, so this is all I have, actually. What I just want to point out is that, so this is sort of a sort of outside view, right, into this complex country that brings out a lot of obstacles and a lot of sort of particular, conditions for gender equality, or the ones that sort of help and the ones that also hamper this whole process. I think if you talk to German women, they would probably tell you very different things, right? So for example, oftentimes I think there's a lot of West German women, some of them, are very interested in gender equality and feminism and so forth. There are also a lot who are not. Certainly, many of the West German men feel like this is really like not necessary. Everybody's doing fine and so forth. In the East, it's a little different, right? Because the East German women had in the old GDR times, they had a lot of experiences that West German women actually are still fighting for in a way. So they don't think feminism is such a great idea. So my experience actually was always that feminism is not something that people think is a good idea in Germany, right? Right now, however, right now that we have influx of refugees from other cultures and so forth, we have sort of a very interesting paradox, I think, where you have on the one hand still this sort of disdain towards feminist ideas coming out of sort of German discourses, and at the same time you have a discourse that says, well, we have gender equality and we don't want to have you because you come from somewhere else where you don't have gender equality. And I find this a very interesting situation in time right now. Okay, sorry, I really went over time. That was it.
Okay. Hi. There we go. So thank you for the opportunity. Thrilled to be here, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to talk about reproduction and work-family life in Germany versus the US, which Susanne already provided a nice overview for. And let me first say that I am not a Germany scholar, neither am I German. But I'm married to a German who's here, so that gives me a lot of authority to talk about these issues. Okay, my research does broadly cover these themes in Germany as well. So the question I want to discuss, and I'll try and do it within 10 minutes, it's kind of a lot to cover, but I'm going to make it simple, and then if you have any further questions, please ask me. But basically, the question is, what are the opportunities, like when you choose to have babies, so whether and when you want to have babies, and then what happens once you have babies. And so your opportunities in actually sort of having family and promoting family well-being in Germany versus the US. So the two questions are, choosing if and when to get pregnant, and what to do with that pregnancy, whether you have a child. And then secondly, combining work and family, especially. So your well-being in bringing up children and the children's well-being, and then combining work and family. And so what I want to do is compare these two dimensions, because they're obviously related, but they're also different in both Germany and the US, and kind of provide a comparison of Germany and the US 20 years ago at the turn of the millennium, and then what's happened today. And I'm going to make the argument that in Germany, at the turn of the millennium, some of the biggest barriers were related to gender inequalities, and they have tried to overcome those. And in the US, at the turn of the millennium, a lot of the biggest barriers were related to economic and class inequalities, and not as much has been done about them, which today puts Germany and German families in a better position moving forward. So first, let's discuss a reproductive choice. And of course, the litmus issue here is abortion. So I'll just broadly outline what happens with abortion in Germany, for those of you who don't know. Germany, in both the US and Germany, abortion is roughly available on demand. However, what happened in Germany is that there is a compromise. Germany is a very Christian Catholic country, as Susanne was saying, especially historically. And so Germany came up with an abortion compromise in the mid-1990s, which basically means that it's actually a crime and the unborn life needs to be protected. But what a woman has to do to get an abortion is go to a counselor whose job is to protect the unborn. She needs to go home, reflect on it for a few days. Sounds kind of patronizing, right, from the perspective of autonomy of a woman. Some women are saying no, some women are saying yes. But it's like you sort of imagine this kind of a priest telling you you're not supposed to do it. It's morally wrong. Fine, if you insist, you can have it. In practice, what happens is you pretty much have access to abortion after you've gone through that patronizing counseling. U.S. Of course, we have Roe v. Wade, 1973, that establishes a woman's right to privacy, and so that's where the abortion right comes from. That has not ended the abortion fights, and basically in the US, well, every political level is a battleground for abortion politics. And this is abortion protesters picketing in front of a clinic. And in fact, in the US, in many ways, abortion is actually, the access is much more complicated than it is in Germany today, despite the federal sort of, the right to, the legal right to abortion. And almost 90% of US counties don't have abortion providers. An abortion for a low-income woman in the US is expensive. In Germany, if you're low income, you get it for free. So, and interestingly, that's like abortion is kind of the most visible issue. But in practice also, the abortion rate in a country often doesn't have that much to do with the legality of it. In fact, countries where abortion is illegal, abortion rates tend to be higher. But in Germany, abortion rate basically is a measure of failed prevention. People who have abortions, they have abortions because they basically, for whatever reason, weren't able to prevent that pregnancy. And here you see that German abortion rate is actually much lower. So women are having less abortions in Germany than they are in the US. In the US, since the turn of the millennium, the abortion rate has gone down, but it's still quite a bit higher than in Germany. Also, and this is, I think, very interesting, this is share of births in the US versus Germany that were unintended. And in the US, it's actually really high. It's the highest in the developed world. And it's almost 35% of pregnancies, of births are unintended. And in Germany, it's about 20%. This basically says that women are able to choose if and when to become pregnant at higher rates in Germany than the US. Susanne already showed this, adolescent fertility rate. That's another measure of failed access to prevention. When teenage girls give birth, it's widely accepted, and UNICEF has said that's, that's a measure of failed access to prevention. And the US has actually improved significantly since the turn of the millennium, but Germany's better. It was in 2000, and it still remains better on that indicator. And in this sense, despite Germany's more conservative ideology, Susanne talked about it, on these issues, Germany actually does better than the US. And the issue where Germany, the conservative ideology has had more of a stranglehold is on the issue of work-family balance. There you see the effects of conservative ideology more strongly. Germany at the turn of the century. Here's a German family with a church strategically above it. Germany, in the post-war era and up until today, has been very supportive in its social policies of families as a unit, but not supportive of women's autonomy. So basically, it's a Christian democratic welfare state. We're going to help everybody. We're going to make sure that children are fed and the men are paid high enough wages that they can support a traditional family and support their dependents, which are women and children. Okay? And you have a heavily maternalist culture and policies that reinforce that. Once you have kids in Germany, you can kind of choose if and when to have them. Once you have them, the expectation is you stay at home. And if that's what you want to do, it's great. The system is built around you. If you don't, it's more of a problem. And so in 2000, Germany had basically all policies were created around stay-at-home moms. And so you don't have daycare. You have paid maternity leave, but it's pretty short. You have half-day schools. The expectation is that kids come home to have lunch. Even grocery store hours are basically open 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, with the expectation that the mom does the grocery shopping then. And you have joint taxation, which basically penalizes the second earner in a family. So all these policies exist to reinforce the traditional gender division of labor. As a result, you have very low rates of maternal employment, especially of women with small children. And once they do go back to work, once a kid goes to school, or maybe when they're 10, they go back part-time. Okay, this is what Susanne referred to as well. 20% in 2000, only 80% of Germans felt that mothers of young children should not be in the workforce. So, if you wanted to be in the workforce after you had kids, that's when life kind of sucked for you in Germany. It was very difficult. Not just because the policies weren't there, it was you didn't have access to daycare, you didn't have access to affordable, not just not daycare, but also everybody condemned you as a bad mom. Okay. As a result, by this time, about a third of women in their 40s were childless, the highest rate in Europe. So the option for you, if you wanted to have a career, was not to have children. Also, as a result, German infertility rates tanked. And so it kind of had the exact opposite effect of what the Catholic doctrine ideal was, right? So, fast forward to 2018. Germans, when they decide something's wrong, you got to give them credit. Like, the train has left the station. They have now realized it's a problem. Oh my gosh, like you need, if you have a generous welfare state, you need to have babies to pay for the pensions, right? You have to have babies. In 2008, you have a massive you have a very significant parental leave reform, and you have the establishment of a right to childcare. So the parental leave reform also, because you have a very traditional culture, what they do is not just extend more maternity leave, but they create this 2-month daddy leave to encourage German fathers, such as this one here, to stay home, bond with their children, and participate in caretaking activities. And part of all of the goals of these policies are to get women and families to have more babies, and also to encourage women to actually be able to come back into the workforce, okay? Because also what Germany was doing, Germany has really highly educated women. They become doctors, they become lawyers, blah, blah, then they stay home with their kids. So kind of from a human capital perspective, on a collective basis, that's a huge loss of human capital. Now, to their credit, fertility is actually climbing up. I mean, attitudes lag, right? Like you don't change anything like this overnight. But maternal employment is also increasing. So, US, how much time do I have? Am I over?
2 minutes.
Oh, I'm good. Can I talk for longer? So, US at the turn of the millennium. US is a very different kind of welfare state, right? So we just basically, we have this system of formal gender equality, right? Like, and the separation of church and state, all of that, and you have you can, if you can try and prove intent to discriminate, you can sue and this kind of stuff. But you have a very market-based system and the most meager and punitive welfare state. I mean, I don't know if you can even really call it a welfare state here, okay? And what that basically, in practice, it means 20 years ago, virtually no work-family reconciliation policies in the US. Everything was left to the market. In 1994, we get the Family Medical Leave Act, which is a huge fight, but it's unpaid. It's 3 months unpaid leave. It only actually applies to about half of the workforce because of these stringent restrictions of you have to work for a company with over 50 employees, you have to have been there at least a year, and so you get 3 months off, but it's unpaid. And so it only applies to about 55%, only about 55% of the workforce in the US is actually eligible for it. You have no national public daycare. And here's an interesting fun fact that most people don't know. In the 1970s, both houses of Congress in the US passed a policy establishing national public daycare, vetoed by Nixon. Little historic, that. We were almost there. And imagine the impact that has had on the generations that have come since. So in the US, if you're well off, you're part of the high-skilled, female executive families, you can, in this country, the market allows you to outsource a lot. You can you can find high quality daycare for your kids. You can like hire a nanny, a cleaning lady. You can manage it, and you can the employment structure. I don't have time to get into it, but also because of the nature of capitalism here, and less labor protections, etc. Employers are actually more likely to hire women into positions of on certain career paths than they are in Germany because of the et cetera, et cetera. However, if you happen to be the cleaning lady or the nanny or the childcare worker, that's when you are screwed, or the minimum wage fast food worker. You cannot afford market-based solutions at all for your children. So if you're wealthy, you're okay. If you're poor, you're not. Fast forward 20 years. Nothing has been done. US remains one of 3 countries in the world with no paid maternity leave. Childcare costs today more than public college tuition in 28 US states. And the irony is because childcare workers, for their skill level, are the lowest paid workers of any profession. Like all that data is out there, and if you get a degree in childcare, you will be in the lowest paid group for your skill level. Yet it costs a fortune, and I would love to see somebody do a real analysis of where all that money goes. Some of it goes to all sorts of crazy insurance. It goes to, did you actually want to, your hand was up, or?
That's just because I was saying that some states in the US, they have enacted paid maternity leave and paid family leave, like New York and also California.
That's right, they have. On a state level, and I can talk more about that, through unemployment insurance. But on a federal level, we don't. But yes, you're right. And so families and moms and dads struggle, and they even struggle more today than they probably did 20 years ago. And now even middle-class families struggle. Like I'm a highly educated, I'm a college professor, and my oldest kid went to public school this year, but last year 40% of my take-home income went to pay for childcare, right? And I'm like in the top, sort of. So like even the middle classes, right? And part of the story is not just about families, but it's about general economic trends in the US. And this is titled for Anemic American Paychecks. Basically, since the 70s, the real wages of the 50% of workers in the US have not increased at all. Everything is going to the top. And in fact, if we had the 99th percentile, that's where like the real increases are. So you have this massive concentration of income and wealth in the US in the top 20, top 10, top 5%. And it's creating, you could almost say, a catastrophic situation for families that are in the 50% and below. And it's interesting because in the 2016 elections, even Trump and Hillary Clinton, they both had family leave on their electoral platforms. Do you remember that? I haven't heard a word about it since then. But they both said, I mean, there's a general recognition that these are concerns. And okay, well, you already showed this, but my last one, I mean, I don't want to end on a totally dystopic note, but we're actually, like in this country, we're killing our mothers. It's really bad. And this is the data. Your data was a little old, actually. And this is from 2015, this Lancet report. And this is...
I have also seen different data.
Yeah, the US basically, the US is the only advanced industrialized country where maternal mortality has increased in the last 15 to 20 years. And so this is the trend. This is where Germany is and the rest of advanced industrialized countries. And in the US, maternal mortality has actually increased. And there's a variety of causes for it, but basically it's a symptomatic of a general situation in this country where it is very difficult today to have a kid, get pregnant, survive childbirth, and then be able to afford. I mean, on that note,
all right. So tonight I'm going to take on the mantle of Marcus Thiel, who couldn't be here tonight. His work looks a lot at the promotion of LGBTI rights in foreign policy. And I'm going to speak a little bit about that in terms of the United States and Germany's foreign policy, and then talk about LGBTI issues in domestic politics as well. So I thought it would be useful to start off just to make sure that we're all on the same page by defining some terms. So if we think about the acronym LGBTI, those letters stand for things that are slightly different. So the L and the G and the B, we can think of relating here to the heart, and they have to do with who you are attracted to romantically or sexually, who you're interested in having as a romantic partner. And lesbians are women who are attracted to other women, gay men are men who are attracted to other men, and bisexual people are sometimes attracted to the same sex and sometimes attracted to the opposite sex. If we think about the T, that stands for transgender, and it has to do with the concept of gender identity, which is up here in the unicorn's thoughts and not in the heart. And if we think about sexual orientation as your attitudes toward other people, gender identity has to do with your beliefs about yourself. So do you feel yourself to be male, or do you feel yourself to be female? And for the vast majority of people, those two things line up. If you have a female body, you might feel female. If you have a male body, you might feel male. But some people feel that their outward appearance doesn't really match who they are inside their head or who they feel that they are. And so that's what transgender refers to. And finally, the I here stands for intersex and has to do with sex characteristics. So this is part of our gender unicorn. And when I talked about sexual orientation and I talked about gender identity, I was kind of assuming that sex is a binary condition. You have either men on one side or women on the other side. I used that same terminology when I talked about political representation, and my colleagues used it when we talked about development or family policies. For over 98% of the population, that is true. But there are people who are not clearly, in a physical sense, male or female. So it doesn't have to do with their heart or their attitudes toward other people. It doesn't have to do with their head and their thoughts about themselves. It has to do with their actual physical characteristics. So usually when a baby's born, the doctor looks at the genitalia and can see this is a boy or this is a girl. Some people are born with ambiguous genitalia, so it's not quite clear. Some people's external genitalia don't match their insides. So someone might think their whole life that they're female, can't get pregnant, and go to a doctor when they're an adult and find out they don't have any ovaries on the inside. It could be that if we do a genetic analysis, a person's not XX chromosomes, which would be female, or XY, which would be male, but are XXY. So they have both sets of chromosomes. So all of these groups we can think of as sexual minorities, and they are minorities in the population. But both the United States and Germany are democracies that call upon or that proclaim support for human rights and have very clear legal provisions in their constitutions that there should be equality under the law, that all people should be equal and treated equally. Well, historically, LGBTI people have not been treated equally under the law, and in fact, to a degree, in many instances, they are still not even recognized under the law. And so both of the United States and Germany have been world leaders in regards to improving LGBTI rights on kind of a global scale. So both countries' foreign policies pay a lot of lip service and also spend money on promoting LGBT rights abroad. So we can see here on the left, Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, gave a noteworthy speech declaring LGBT rights as human rights. If we look at the United States State Department and the USAID, both organizations spend money on promoting LGBT rights abroad, helping groups, helping improve the legal status and the lived conditions of LGBT people abroad. If we look at Germany, Germany has built in the middle of Berlin now a memorial to gays and lesbians who were killed during the Holocaust. This is kind of a concrete block, and if you look in the window, you can see videos of men kissing. Germany has what's called the Bundesstiftung Magnus Hirschfeld. This is a national taxpayer-funded organization that also promotes LGBT rights abroad and links LGBT groups in Germany with other groups internationally. And Germany's worked closely with the European Union to make LGBTI rights a cornerstone of what it means to be a member of the EU, what's required to join the EU, and what kind of foreign policy the EU covers. So both countries have been active abroad, and they've also been active in improving LGBTI rights within their own countries. So if we start off with especially lesbian and gay citizens, for years and years in both countries, their romantic relationships or their commitments to each other were not enshrined in law. So that if, for example, one partner died, the other partner didn't automatically enjoy the same inheritance rights that same-sex couples enjoyed. They didn't enjoy the right to stay in a property. The surviving spouse could be kicked out if their name wasn't on the lease. They weren't entitled to employment benefits, for example, which in Germany are very considerable. People couldn't visit each other in the hospital or in prison. They had to testify against each other. There were all sorts of ways in which the non-recognition of relationships caused problems for lesbian and gay couples. The first country in the world to legally recognize same-sex partnerships was Denmark. That happened in 1989. For a lot of the 1990s, nothing really happened. But starting in the early 2000s, both Germany and the United States took some leading stances. In 2001, at the federal level, Germany legalized what they called registered life partnerships. Registered life partnerships were kind of akin to what we might call civil unions in this country. They weren't the same thing as marriage. They didn't include the exact same rights. So, for example, these marriage bonus tax policies that help one partner support the family and kind of give a big tax break for that, same-sex couples weren't eligible for policies like that under the registered life partnership. Starting in 2000, Vermont was the first U.S. state to legalize civil unions. Between 2001 and 2016 in Germany and 2000 and 2014 in the United States, the rights of same-sex couples were expanded. In Germany, life partnerships became closer and closer to marriage as a result of a lot of court decisions, which basically said life partnerships violated the equal treatment of the Constitution. Why should same-sex partners not have the same rights as married couples? We can see in the United States, lots and lots of states start moving toward civil unions or moving toward marriage, although there were also states in the United States that took the opposite tack and banned that. In 2015, the US Supreme Court said that same-sex couples must have the right to marry. And in 2017, the German Bundestag legalized what they call Ehe für alle, or marriage for everybody, in Germany. If we turn toward transgender rights, both Germany and the United States have within them some legal provisions to help recognize transgender people. So one issue that's of primary importance to people who are transgender, who want to live life as the opposite sex into which they are born, is getting their identity documents to match the sex that they are living as now, which means changing birth certificates to reflect the new sex, and changing things like driver's licenses or social security cards, university IDs, and stuff like that. And so Germany has what they call a transsexual law. They've had it since the late 1980s, which allows people to change their sex and their name in Germany on their legal documents. And currently the rule is that you have to have lived as the opposite sex for 3 years, state that you're not going to change your mind, and go through a legal process. Earlier in Germany, so between now and back in the 1980s, there were some more onerous requirements in Germany. One requirement was that if a person was married, they had to divorce their spouse. So there was a case in Germany where a couple had been married for decades, and one partner decided that they wanted to live their life as a woman instead of a man, and the law said, well, you can do that, but you have to divorce your wife. And the person said, well, I love her, she's standing by me, we want to be married, we've been married for decades. It seems like a violation of my human rights and my right to family, which is in the German Constitution. And so they took the case to the Constitutional Court, and that provision was taken out. Similarly, Germany used to require that a person have surgery to remove their reproductive organs before they could have their sex changed, which for some trans people is fine. That's what they want to do. But for other trans people, they don't perhaps want that surgery, which is could be life-threatening because it involves anesthesia. So there was another case where a trans woman wanted to change her sex, and the government said, well, you can do that, but you have to have a hysterectomy, you have to have your ovaries removed and your reproductive organs removed. And she said, well, you know, I'm 60. Even if those organs are in there, they're not going to be reproducing. And so, again, the Constitutional Court said this is basically akin to torture or a violation of bodily integrity and human rights. And so that policy has been removed. In the United States, we don't have a federal law. We have a patchwork of state laws, just like with the abortion issue. So there are 2 states in the United States where there's no provision for changing your sex. Some US states require surgery, like Germany used to. Florida requires that a person be undergoing, quote unquote, appropriate clinical treatment in order to change their gender. On documents. The problem is the World Health Organization has said being transgender is not a disease, so there is no appropriate treatment. Up until Amendment 4 passed, it was also true in Florida, or, well, it's still true in Florida. If you're a felon and you've had your rights removed in Florida, you can't change your sex. In California, it's a little bit easier. It's just a legal process that you go to court and you say, I want to change my sex, and then you can change it. The Trump administration has said that it, for the purposes of federal programs, is not going to recognize transgender people. It says the only valid sex is what's on your birth certificate, which is determined by external genitalia. And if there's any doubt, then we could do a genetic test. But we know biologically that some people can't, that there are some people that don't even fit into these guidelines. But actually, the Trump administration has no control over people's birth certificates. Those are state laws. And the last thing that I want to talk about are intersex rights. And again, the issue that's at stake right now, and part of what came out of this 2009 CEDAW process, is that you can't even be intersex. Or traditionally, you couldn't have been intersex, right? Your birth certificate has to say male or female. Well, that's changed in Germany as a result of this CEDAW process. Current German law says that you can basically leave your birth certificate blank. You don't have to declare male or female. Some intersex people have argued that's not a good policy because it still doesn't recognize us being intersex. There's not a positive option. And the German Supreme Court has agreed with that, and the current administration has been charged with the court by making a positive option on birth certificates. We can see in the United States, in Oregon, California, and Washington, D.C., you can now pick an X on a birth certificate, so you can be male, female, or X. And Maine and Colorado allow people to do that on their driver's licenses. So in the United States, we have some places where we have intersex recognition. We can see that growing in Germany. And again, Germany is one of the leading countries in this regard around the world in giving recognition to intersex people. So I will stop here. And I think we'll open up the floor to you. It's probably easiest, I think, if the panelists come up here. And then, Lukas, you can be free to moderate.
Great. So let's get us started on our Q&A session. I would like to collect a couple of questions, maybe 3 to 4, and then pose them to the panel. So any questions? Yes.
So I have a question that I noted for each person's presentation. For Dr. Schmich, for the presentation on representative democracy, I was wondering whether or not your definition of women, and you had already addressed this in the research, does or does not include trans women and also women of color. Mm-hmm. And so, for instance, if women of color are a minority group in Germany, and you say that there are, 37% of women in German parliament, are they mostly just white women, or are they also immigrant women, or women, trans women, or women of color? For Dr. Zwingel's presentation on gender-related human development indicators and also CEDAW, I was wondering, are the numbers of inequality accounted for in the U.S. for difference? And so, for instance, is it worse if you looked at only marginalized women in the U.S., and if the U.S. has more marginalized women within itself, wouldn't its numbers automatically look worse off than Germany? So, for instance, maternal mortality rates in the U.S. is like, super high for African American women, and I imagine Germany would not necessarily have that same problem. And then also for Dr. Blofield, I was looking at the 2018 overhaul of the child policies in Germany. Is that because the German people somehow became enlightened, or is it in response to the growing nationalism in Germany due to the refugee crisis, when people were saying, oh, you guys shouldn't take the refugees to sort of help your welfare system in the future? And then it's like, well, we want Germans for Germany, so then we want our women to have more children, and we need to overhaul these children families so that we can continue to be nationalistic and, not allow refugees in.
Do you want to go in?
Do you want to collect a couple of questions?
Well, it was one person, but perhaps one more question to go.
It's kind of building what Manisha said. Have you looked at the disaggregated data for maternity rates? Is it the same for
Maternal mortality?
Maternal mortality, right, for white women? So is it like the same?
No.
It's the same, right?
It's not the same.
Oh, it's not the same.
No.
But
No,
we will
African
still be
American women.
leading. So if we were to remove African American women and Hispanic women and Asian women out of the picture, will the United States look like the rest of
No.
the developed world?
It's
Or
still
will
worse.
still worse?
It's still worse.
Thank you.
One
Sorry,
more,
Eddie.
okay.
I'm just curious about how the Turkish immigrants in Germany stand in this conversation. That the fertility rates, is it higher compared to non-Turkish, or do they have different gender discussions that are related to like anti-immigrant attitudes, anti-Muslim, for instance? Do they have a higher rate of staying at home? So I was just curious about those, because those are also Turkish voters, right? So those are people who vote in Turkish elections, and they have an impact on Turkish politics as well. So that's why I'm interested.
Okay, let's take these questions, and then we'll do another round.
All right. I can start. I can't complain that I only had 10 minutes to talk, because I was the one that made the rules. But when I do this presentation in a larger period of time, one of the things that I think is really important to talk about is intersectionally, who are these women and who does get elected. And we can see that in both the United States and in Germany, minority women are underrepresented. So if we look at the United States, we had a number of firsts just this year. I mean, how long have we been on Native American land? Well, the first Native American woman was just elected, 2 weeks ago. In Germany, however, there's an interesting dynamic between, there's no national party in Germany that has quotas for race or ethnicity, but for many left-wing parties, it is important that they have a range of people of ethnic backgrounds on their party lists. And so one thing that I think, I don't know the exact numbers for Germany, but I've seen in a number of contexts, minority women are actually advantaged in the sense that they, if a party's looking to put together a list, a minority woman can kill two birds with one stone, right? They can fill their female quota and they can show minority representation. So if we look at like the ratio of Turkish men to Turkish women in German politics, I think women are better represented, Turkish women are better represented than Turkish men, because they're fulfilling that quota. And in fact, one of the things I didn't say was that Angela Merkel has attributed part of her success to being a woman, or to the quotas that exist in Germany. And she's also somebody who's done well in her party, because her party's mostly made of West Germans and she's East Germans. Her party's mostly made of men, she's a woman, and her party is mostly made of Catholics and she's a Protestant. So they are trying to balance all of those things, and so it was advantageous to her in parts of her career. But that doesn't overcome the fact that in Germany and in the United States, minority women are even more poorly poorly represented than our majority women.
Yeah, and I mean, just to add to this, I think, I mean, in Germany, this is called people with migration background, people with Migrationshintergrund, right? And I think for this last, this current Bundestag is like, I think 5% or something like that of people with some kind of migration background who are in the Bundestag. And that doesn't include only people of Turkish descent, but French people, English people, and so forth. So it's like, you know, all kinds of Europeans in there also. So it's, so people, you know, migrants of whatever kind are severely underrepresented in the Bundestag. The question with the how intersectional identities are represented in those UNDP data. I mean, they are not. This is very crude data, right? And I do want to say before I'm, you know, critical as you rightly are about this. What is, I think, interesting about the data that we have on the international level is that at some point we did not have that. We did not have data disaggregated by sex. So we did have data about employment ratios, but we did not know how many men and how many women worked. I mean, this is a reality. And actually, if you look at the work of the CEDAW committee, which has been out there for a few decades, they still, and in the beginning more strongly so, this is one thing that they always urge people to do, you know what your men and women, and not about transgender and so forth, but just this very basic distinction, provide data about this, because only then can you push any policy forward, right? So in a way, what we have now, even if you think it's not sufficient, it has been worse before. So I also want to see some progress there in a way. But in addition to that, I mean, all this data, and I think this was partially already answered. You know, if you add additional dimensions of marginalization, then the data looks different. Yes, the most, you know, the most wealthy women are of course less affected by maternal mortality. Minority women are more affected. So there's different dimension that you can factor in there. And as Merike already said, I mean, the maternal mortality rate for African American women in the US is, I think, 3 times or 4 times as high as for white women. So pretty bad. And I think there was one other thing that I can't remember right now. But maybe not. Okay.
Yeah, if you're African American woman giving birth, you have a higher likelihood to survive in Cuba than here. So the question about the family law reform, yeah, I could see. I mean, that's actually a good hypothesis, but it's not quite correct because the family law reform actually took place in 2008. And the reasons for the reform and the overhaul of the family policies, I mean, there was a serious concern about the fertility and low levels of maternal employment, but it's also very much an electoral issue. Women were not satisfied. And as women went into politics more, as Louise was talking about it, these became issues that became politicized. And they were there was like a clear electoral component, and some of the And you even saw that where some of the male politicians were like, oh, women's issues, and then women would bring them forward, and they were actually successful electorally because they, you know, most younger women want to change. And so it wasn't about immigration. What's interesting now is that in Germany, immigrant women are actually having more kids than Germans. And so in terms of increasing German diversity, that's a good thing. And of course, that also is a partial account. I mean, because, yeah, there's different solutions to fertility crisis. One is like help families combine work and family. And the other solution is to encourage immigration. And in fact, that's what the Germans had done in the 70s when Nordic countries decided, let's integrate women into the workforce. Germany decided instead to have these Turkish guest workers and keep women at home. But that has now, that is changing. Interestingly, the people who tend to be the most xenophobic are also the most eager to keep women at home. And so the xenophobes who talk about Germans having more babies and Germans having more white babies, they're the same ones that aren't interested in like providing subsidized public child care. They want to give some kind of a family bonus maybe for the white women to stay home. So they tend to be like traditionalist and very, very conservative on multiple dimensions. in terms of just, wasn't directly asked, but I'm just going to throw this in there, the inequality issue in Germany versus the US. I mean, both countries, like the gender wage gap is about, like women earn about 70 cents to the male dollar. What is actually more fundamental, and that goes back to my point that class can be a more fundamental challenge than gender. Gender is easier to overcome when you decide to do it. Like in the US, like the occupational gap, like the salary difference between a worker, a floor worker, and a senior manager, this is actually from the 1990s, but it was like a senior manager in Germany earned about 5 times more than the worker. In the US, it was 30 times more. I mean, that's where the huge gaping gap and the biggest challenge for the US is.
Can I just, because I remember that Orçun had this question with Turkish women, how they are integrated into whatever family policies or gender equality policies. And I think this is a very paradoxical process, because first, of course, there was this assumption that they're actually not really part of Germany, right? Because they are the guest workers and they hopefully go back at some point and we don't have to take care of it. So very little integration into the state is responsible. They are part of the state and the state is also responsible for them. Hence has to pay attention to their particular living situation and needs and so forth, right? And I think this has sort of changed a little bit over time, but it's still very, very hesitant. So I think Germany has this problem of not really understanding how much of an immigration country it is, and sort of take advantage of all those people who are there and contribute, and build a state that says, well, we have those different needs that we somehow have to respond to. And I think that, we have sometimes talked about this, I think, in private also, that explains to a certain degree the orientation of Turks in Germany towards the Erdogan regime, I think, right? Because they just really still don't feel they're really accepted and part of it after a very long time.
Okay, so now the next one.
I'm going to ask a very graduate student question and ask about methodology. I wanted to, because I noticed that a lot of it was reliant upon statistics. So I wanted to ask you guys, in terms of your individual research, what kind of sources you kind of used and what methods you used. And if, we're historians, so we tend to be wary of over-reliance on statistics and what we gain or lose from using statistics in our own research. So very graduate student question.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback off of the graduate student methodology question, because I was thinking about this too, because I don't remember which one of you said that if there's no hard data to back up these arguments, then nothing gets done in terms of policy. So if nothing gets done in terms of policy and feminist goals can't be advanced without this hard data, why is it that most feminist methodologies tend to be very qualitative? And at least from what I understand, so should feminists in academia at least be moving a little bit more towards quantitative methods? Or I want to get your because all three of you had just hard stats. So.
Maybe two more questions.
Well, I'm going to ask a very narrow question, not graduate student at all. I have a question, Dr. Zwingel. I'm very curious about these dynamics in the East and Western Germany, and the reaction of the Eastern German men, because going back to xenophobia and sexism, how they correlate. In Russia, for example, they overreact when there's external influence on the gender positions, inside the society. So I wonder how the Germans reacted on Soviet invasion in this private domain. Like, how did they react? And how women react, and what kind of policy was that? Like, I'm very curious what happened. I never thought about that before.
In the GDR?
Yeah, in the East and West Germany, the difference between, the backgrounds.
One more question.
I guess Dr. Zwingel and Dr. Blofield, you guys both brought up the rates of teen pregnancy, and Dr. Blofield, you called this a failure of prevention, and I guess you didn't address it. But I don't know if either of you know, does Germany have standardized sex education? Because obviously that to me would seem like something that majorly accounts for this, and I was just kind of curious what Germany's policy is on that.
I actually don't know.
Yes. Oh.
No,
When I was growing up, no.
No, they do now, because actually that's one of the, to kind of address part of your question about how Russians don't like external influences, right? Well, it's not just the Russians. There are a lot of people who don't like what's so-called gender ideology, right? That's what's driving the Trump administration's wanting not to recognize transgender people. That's part of the AfD's appeal in Germany.
That's the far-right party.
Right, the far-right party in Germany. And one of their biggest things is that they are very upset because whenever the Greens get into power, like that picture up there, that gender unicorn that we saw, like the gender unicorn is very, very upsetting for them. And there are, when Green governments try to include that in education, they organize street demonstrations and try to stop that in educational plans. So the German sex education, I think it might vary depending on, because it's a state-level policy, what governments in power at the state level. But where there are Green, social democratic governments, there's very detailed sex education to the...
That said, it's safe to assume that they're doing a better job than they are here across the board, because otherwise we would see a higher abortion rate and higher teenage pregnancy rates, because that's the only, you have two outcomes when you get pregnant. You either have an abortion or you have a pregnancy. You carry it to term, right? And the indicators show that Germans, for whatever reason, managed to do better on those.
And it's not because of abstinence?
It's not because of that. Let's turn to the Germans.
So I don't really have a lot to say about a feminist, what feminists should do methodologically, because I think storytelling and qualitative research and learning about people's lived experience is really important, right? And those qualitative methods can tell us about problems that people are having. But I think it's also important from a policymaking perspective that we are able to get data to document these types of problems. So, for example, when Lukas did my introduction, he mentioned that I edited a volume that looks at minority women and policymaking in Germany. And one of the biggest problems that minority women or minority groups often have is trying to even find out whether there is a problem. So, for example, Hamburg, with a northern state in Germany, wanted to undertake some educational reforms. And part of the way that educational reforms were packaged and sold was this would help kind of oppressed Turkish girls, break free from the bonds with their parents and get education and become integrated into German society. But actually, that state did not disaggregate its educational attainment data by gender and by ethnicity. So there's absolutely no data for anybody to know what educational outcomes different girls and boys from different ethnic groups had. And so if we can talk to people and find out that those are issues and problems, then we might know where we could collect data. But I think that there's value to doing both of those things.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's also a tension in it, right? I mean, whenever you make something visible, by sort of hard data or something, you also obscure something else in a way, it seems to me. Or you could say, like, you move in one step towards making something visible, and then you want to make it intersectional maybe, but then you don't have maybe from an advocacy perspective a strong position to say this is good for women, right? Because now you see what's different for different different types of women, right? But I also think, just echoing what Louise said before, and also maybe taking in this, what about feminist, post-positivist ideas of not counting and so forth, right? I think there's different things that have a certain function and good intention in different contexts. They don't have to be the same thing. They can nevertheless talk to each other, I think, right? So I think it's important to have this tension clear. For example, again, if you wanna make a certain position visible, I think in LGBTI areas this is a big deal to say on the one hand, we have to make those identities visible. But on the other hand, actually, we are talking here about gender fluidity. We actually don't want to have a very stringent heteronormative system, right? So how can you do both? It's very difficult to do both, right? So there is a tension, and I think this can be more or less productive. And I would never say either one or the other is the right way to go.
But do you think they can be combined?
Absolutely. I mean, I think so. I mean, I think the more data, the better. And we have social scientific methods to try to collect it in reliable and valid ways. Of course, there's going to be some issue regarding categorization that is always a challenge. I say the more data, the better, because as a political scientist, also when somebody studies policy, until something is visible and until you have that data, you can't make the argument that, you know, if we don't have data, for example, on maternal mortality by economic status and race and ethnicity, we can't, you know, then it's very hard to narrowly identify the problem in a more specific way and to make a powerful case as to why we need to improve. But it's up to us as scholars to interpret that data. And in fact, my research is qualitative. I trace like policies, and so you know I use descriptive data, but I don't crunch numbers. I look at the policy process. I interview political actors about framing and agenda setting. But it's very difficult. Like I studied domestic workers' rights. I mean, if we don't know how many domestic workers exist, what they get paid, how many of them are live in and live out, we're not going to be able to advocate for them and to create better policies.
I think that we should, I think we have a lovely reception with live music. So Lukas has some closing words, but we should continue this conversation, but over drinks and food.
All right. So just in closing, I would like to ask for one more applause for our distinguished panelists.